Hey guys, tonight we're heading back to a time where desire was dangerous, privacy was imaginary, and even your thoughts might send you straight to hell. Welcome to the medieval world, where sex was everywhere and nowhere at once, whispered about behind veils, punished from the pulpit, and tightly wrapped in the itchy wool of sin and shame. Your body might wake up hungry, but good luck feeding that fire without divine consequences. The mattress you didn't quite sleep on is just a wooden board with some hay and regrets. And right now, as the sun hasn't yet risen and the frost crusts your breath, the last thing you need is temptation. But there it is, a heat inside your chest that your blankets didn't cause. The person next to you, possibly your spouse, possibly just someone warm, is asleep or pretending to be. Either way, you can't risk moving too close. You think about the church's warning. Lust is one of the 7 deadlies. Worse, it breeds more sins. You shouldn't be feeling anything before prayers. You should be purifying your mind. But your body hasn't read the Bible, and it has its own agenda. You pull your tunic tighter. Even that slight movement reminds you of the ache between your legs. An ache you've been taught to fear, to shame, to confess. Morning wood. That's not something people talk about here. You don't even have a word for it that wouldn't be followed by punishment or penance. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You roll off the board and kneel. Not out of desire, but obligation. You whisper your morning prayers with eyes half closed and mind still wandering. You don't mention the dreams, the ones that felt too vivid, too warm, too wet, the ones where your hands touch more than grain or goats, the ones with someone's mouth on your neck, someone whose name you're too afraid to even think. Historians still argue whether medieval people felt more guilt than we do, or whether they were simply better at pretending. But the guilt is real, humming in your spine. You wonder if it's always been like this tug of war between wanting and fearing, between needing and kneeling. You make it to the stream before sunrise, breaking the ice to wash your face and think of other things. But it's no good. You catch your reflection in the water and wonder if the devil really does live in your thoughts, or if he's just your body, misunderstood. Someone once told you that monks train to suppress arousal by sitting in cold water or flogging their backs with nettles. You think of them now and wonder if they were ever tempted by the same person who sneezed into your face this morning. In town, gossip travels faster than any horse. The miller's daughter smiled too long at the shepherd. She's a witch. The priest's assistant was caught humming a love song. He's possessed. You've heard it all. You've repeated some. And yet, when it's your own hunger gnawing at your belly, suddenly gossip feels like self-defense. There's a phrase you heard once, probably during a sermon, possibly during a tavern brawl. Even saints burned before they were canonized. You cling to that tonight. Because if saints were allowed to wrestle with desire, maybe you're not entirely doomed. But still, it's morning now, and you're awake and wanting. And the guilt settles in beside you like an old friend who never pays rent. You're in the market square now, shivering under 3 layers of patched linen, but it's not the cold making you sweat. It's the proximity. Bodies brushing past, fingertips grazing yours by accident, a flash of someone's ankle beneath a mud-splattered hem. You tell yourself you're imagining it, that you're not actually aroused by an exposed wrist or the slope of a neck. But when your gaze lingers a moment too long, your body disagrees. Desire is a strange beast here, publicly condemned, privately cultivated, and universally misunderstood. You grew up learning that lust is a sin, but no one ever explained what to do when it blooms in your stomach like a second heart. There are no pamphlets, no diagrams, only shame and mystery, and the occasional poorly translated Latin warning etched into a church wall. You duck your head as a local widow passes. Her scarf is too loose today, her mouth redder than usual. She doesn't look at you, but the scent of something herbal clings to her as she moves. Something warming. Something that makes you wish you hadn't fasted this morning. Historians still argue whether perfumes and tinctures were used to attract lovers or simply to mask unwashed skin. Either way, it's working. Back in the day, folk believed certain herbs could spark desire or dampen it. Pennyroyal, rue, mugwort. Dangerous things, depending on how they're used. Your neighbor swears a sprig of basil in your bedding invites dreams of your future lover. Another insists basil invites demons. Welcome to medieval sex education. Part apothecary, part folklore, part guesswork. You walk quickly now, trying to clear your thoughts. But the town is alive, full of unintentional invitations, laughter, soft voices, curved waists, half-laced boots. Everything is too close and not close enough. You remember a story a bard once told about a nun who secretly carved love poems into the wooden beams of her convent. They found them years later, faded and furious with longing. You pass the baker's stall and try not to look at the way the dough is being kneaded. Rhythmic, steady. Hands pressing into pliant softness. Stop it. Bread is not sensual. Bread is survival. You divert to the fountain in the center of town, splashing your face with water so cold it bites. You breathe. You pray. You pretend. You think about saints and martyrs and cold stone tombs. There's a boy watching you from under a wool cap. Or maybe a girl. Hard to tell in the layers. Either way, they look away when you look back. Cheeks flushed with either chill or recognition. You feel something coil inside you, both fear and thrill. Back home, your hands are still wet from the fountain, your heart still racing. You think again of the dream from last night, the one you haven't told a soul about. You try to forget the warmth of that dream body, the imagined weight of another person's breath on your neck. Your cousin is nearby, humming as they hang herbs from the rafters. You envy their calm. Or maybe you envy the way they don't seem tortured by thoughts like yours. Or maybe they do. Maybe everyone does, and no one dares say it. Remember that priest who vanished a few winters ago? Some say he fled to Rome. Others say he ran off with a merchant's son. You like the second story better. It feels possible. You settle by the hearth and stare at the fire, willing it to burn away the ache inside you. But it doesn't. It flickers like desire itself, hungry, insistent, and wholly beyond your control. You're chopping vegetables now, if you can call these limp roots vegetables. A turnip, half soft, an onion that might be more mold than bulb. Each slice is a slow meditation, a way to keep your hands busy while your mind spirals elsewhere. Because despite the hunger curling in your belly, it isn't just food you crave, it's touch. Real, intentional touch. Not the accidental shoulder bump at the well, or the shared blanket with your coughing cousin. You long for something deliberate, someone reaching for you with purpose, not by accident, not out of obligation, but because they want to. But of course, want is dangerous. You stir the pot and think of the village girls who were sent away last year. No one says the word pregnant aloud, but the implication clings like chimney soot. One returned with hollow eyes. One didn't return at all. And the third, she's suddenly married to an older man who conveniently inherited a cow. Historians still argue whether medieval communities were more lenient or more cruel when it came to premarital sex. But the pattern remains. If you're poor, female, and visibly pregnant, you vanish, socially or physically. There are whispered stories, though. Hidden liaisons in haylofts, secret births in the woods. A woman named Annalise, who allegedly disguised herself as a man for 6 whole years just to follow her lover to a distant monastery. You like that one. You reach for the salt and spill some on the table. A bad omen, they say. You toss a pinch over your shoulder to ward off misfortune, then wipe your hands on your tunic. Someone knocks at the door. It's a neighbor, middle-aged, blunt-featured, carrying a sack of dried beans and an odd sort of tension in his stance. You trade a hunk of cheese for the beans, and as he lingers a beat too long, your skin prickles. Is this suggestive, or are you imagining it again? There's a strange dance to these interactions. Glances that last a second too long, voices softening for no reason. You're never sure if anything's being offered. You're never sure if you want it to be. You watch him go, the back of his cloak swaying in the wind, and wonder how many of your neighbors are quietly, privately tangled in affairs of the flesh. Statistically, it must be most of them. After all, sex is everywhere in this world, buried under layers of shame, but still poking through like weeds in frost. Even the church can't stop talking about it. Every sermon seems obsessed with temptation, with chastity, with hellfire for carnal sin. The louder they shout, the more curious you become. You remember the carved relief on the chapel's outer wall. Saint Anthony tempted by nude demons. Except, those demons weren't entirely grotesque. You've looked at them more than once. You felt strange afterward. They say sex is for procreation only. They say pleasure is a distraction from piety. They say anyone caught lying together unlawfully will face penance, fasting, public shaming, perhaps even exile. But who's watching? Who gets to decide what counts as unlawful? Certainly not the priest who keeps getting lost during evening confession. You wrap the cheese in cloth and stash it in the cool corner. Your hands are shaking, though you don't feel cold. Sometimes, at night, you lie awake thinking about bodies. Not in a lustful way. Not always. Sometimes it's just the sheer nearness of another person that haunts you. The way skin feels against skin. The idea that someone might brush your hair from your face and not recoil at your winter breath or your calloused hands. You once dreamed of a bath shared with someone. Just warm water, soft laughter, and the absence of fear. That dream has stuck with you for weeks. They say in faraway cities, there are houses where people go just to be touched. Bathhouses with attendants, salons where hands and mouths speak languages your tongue doesn't know. You don't know if those places really exist, but you imagine them in color. Saffron linens, candles flickering like stars, bodies that don't flinch from need. The stew is bubbling now. It smells earthy and bland. You sit by the fire and think about secret. Everyone has them. That old widow probably remembers every kiss she ever stole in the shadows. That smithy apprentice always smells like cloves and never meets your eye. That boy who sells eggs and whistles tunelessly. You once caught him reading a poem that wasn't about chickens. Desire is a kind of hunger you aren't taught how to feed. But tonight you're full of it. The sky outside shifts from muddy grey to something approaching daylight, though the sun remains stubbornly absent. You lace your boots tighter, ignoring the stiff leather biting into your ankles, and head toward the pasture. There's work to be done. Always. The ox is just where you left it, snorting steam into the morning air, its bulk swaying slightly as it chews yesterday's hay, like it resents you personally. You reach into the feed sack and dump another armful into the trough. No thanks. Not even eye contact. Typical. As your fingers brush frost off the fence post, your mind drifts again. This time to marriage. In theory, it's the solution to everything. Stability, legitimacy, sanctioned sex, a bed that might be warm for reasons beyond the proximity of livestock. But marriage in your village isn't exactly romantic. It's transactional. A handful of goats, a plot of cabbage land, maybe an old dagger as a wedding gift if your in-laws are sentimental. You know couples who seem fond of each other. They work side by side. They laugh sometimes. But you also know couples who exist like two wooden spoons in the same drawer. Functional, never touching. The church says marriage is sacred. The village says marriage is survival. And you aren't quite sure where you fall on the spectrum. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants married for love or necessity. The answer is likely both, but heavily tilted toward whichever had a dowry. You step over a frozen rut and remember the story of Tom and Elia, two sweethearts who were caught lying together before the banns were read. Their punishment: 3 days in the stocks and a month of carrying stones to the mill. They married after that. Maybe because they had to. Maybe because it was easier than walking through town alone. There's a girl you sometimes trade with. Dark hair, sharper eyes than she lets on. Once, when your fingers brushed over a shared jug of ale, she didn't pull away. You've thought about that for weeks. Sometimes, you think about what it would be like to build a life together. Not just survive side by side, but exist intentionally. The idea makes your chest ache. But these thoughts are luxuries. You don't have the time or the social standing to indulge in them. You have chores and neighbors who gossip and a body that aches long before nightfall. Still, something stirs inside you. You finish with the ox and head toward the well. The bucket rope is frozen again, so you hack at the ice with the side of a spoon you sharpened into a tool last winter. The cold bites through your sleeves. Everything does, eventually. As the water sloshes into your pail, you think of how your parents met. You were told it was an arrangement. But once, when your mother thought no one was looking, she touched your father's hand in a way that didn't seem arranged at all. Even in the coldest places, something warm can bloom. You haul the water back home and find your cousin at the hearth, stirring the stew with a stick. She's wearing your other tunic, the one you patched last spring. She doesn't ask. You don't protest. That's how things work here. She raises an eyebrow and says, "You've got that look again." You ask what look. The look like you're thinking too hard about things that'll get you in trouble. She's not wrong. You shrug, sit on the floor near the fire, and stretch your legs. The steam from the pot fogs your face, and for a moment you let yourself sink into the scent. Roots, a hint of fat, and the familiar mustiness of survival. Later, someone mentions a gathering in the next hamlet over. Not a festival exactly, more like a communal mending night. People bring clothes to patch, stories to share, and sometimes there's music if anyone's fingers aren't too stiff to play. You decide to go, not because your tunic needs patching, though it does, but because you need to see someone's face that isn't crusted with smoke or resentment. As dusk falls, you wrap yourself in every garment you can find and make your way across the fields, a tian in hand. The wind whistles in your ears like a warning, but your feet carry you forward. You tell yourself it's just for conversation, just for warmth. But maybe, just maybe, you're looking for something else. The hamlet glows ahead of you, faint light flickering from between shutter slats and crude glass panes. You follow the path with careful steps, lantern swinging low, the snow crunching underfoot in that way it does when it's too cold to be soft, like someone ground up bones and scattered them across the countryside. Inside the gathering hall, a repurposed barn really. The air is warmer than you expected. Not cozy, not gentle, but warm the way a breath held too long inside your coat is warm. The heat of many bodies, laughter choked by winter, and something vaguely vegetal cooking in the corner. You duck through the low door and find a spot on the edge of a crowd mostly occupied with mending clothes. You spot her again, the girl with the dark hair and quiet hands. She doesn't look up. Not at first. But when she does, her gaze lands on you like a coal placed gently on a frostbitten hand. Unexpected, welcome, and just slightly painful. You busy yourself with a torn glove, threading a dull needle with your stiff fingers. Around you, conversations ripple in waves. Gossip, laments about oxen, off-color jokes whispered behind patched sleeves. The mood isn't exactly festive, but it has that edge of shared exhaustion. the kind that turns into camaraderie when no one has the energy to pretend otherwise. Someone pulls out a rebec, thin and high and nasal, and starts to play. A woman hums along. There's no dancing, not with the floor this muddy, but there's tapping feet and a few twirls of cloth and laughter that sounds real. You remember the time a traveling priest visited and warned against these idle gatherings, claiming that sin breeds best where boredom meets warmth. But frankly, sin sounds better than shivering alone in the dark. Historians still argue whether these kinds of peasant minglings were innocent, subversive, or merely tolerated. What's clear is that they happened. And when it's cold, dark, and grim outside, human beings will always find ways to huddle closer. Even if the church frowns on the reasons why, she sits beside you eventually. Doesn't say anything, just shares a bit of lint-wrapped bread she's pulled from a pouch sewn into her skirt. You break it in half without asking. It's stale, but sweet. Maybe honey. Maybe hope. You talk. Softly. Nothing heavy. Names of livestock. A story about someone falling into a latrine. A mock complaint about someone stealing all the good turnips. It's nothing. It's everything. It's proof you're still human under all the layers of wool, smoke, and seasonal despair. Someone tells a joke loud enough for the whole room to hear. Something about a monk, a cow, and a missing pair of boots. And laughter erupts. For a moment, the barn feels alive in a way that your cottage never does. It feels less like surviving and more like living. Or the memory of living anyway. Later, as the rebec gives way to silence, and most people drift off in pairs or alone, you help clean up a bit. Folding threadbare blankets, stacking splintered stools, brushing slush from the threshold. The girl thanks you for your help with a voice so low, you almost miss it. She lingers a moment. Her hand brushes yours, not by accident. That night, back in your own bed, cold again, damp again, someone snoring beside you like a dying accordion. You think about her warmth. You think about how little it takes to matter. Sex, in your world, isn't candlelight and rose petals. It's whispered moments in shared haylofts. It's marriages arranged to secure a fence line. It's an escape from the cold, a rebellion against dying, and sometimes, rarely, it's something more. You pull the blanket tighter, bones aching. In the quiet, you remember the joke from the barn. You smile, and then you sleep. Not warm, not safe, but just for tonight a little less alone. You wake to the sound of someone coughing. Deep, chesty, the kind that rattles like firewood tumbling in a crate. It's still dark out, but that means little. Winter mornings come slowly, like reluctant servants, and the sky stays grey long after the fire is lit. You push off the stiff blanket and feel the floor with your feet. It's cold. Of course it is. Your toes curl instinctively. Someone has moved your boots again. You find them near the hearth, frozen into awkward shapes. You jam your feet in anyway, hissing through clenched teeth. By the time you make it outside, the sun is beginning to rise, if you can call it that. A pale smear on the horizon, as though someone rubbed chalk across wet slate. You head toward the baker's hut. There might be bread left from yesterday if you're early, or if the baker owes you a favor, or if you're lucky. You are rarely lucky, but today he's there. Flour on his elbows, soot on his cheeks, and a face lined like tree bark. He's leaning into the warmth of his oven, not out of love for the bread, but to warm his bones. He offers you a heel of rye. It's dry, hard and glorious. You nod in thanks and gnaw as you walk. Marriage is on your mind today. It's on everyone's, always. Even when there's no food, no wood, and no money for more thatch. Someone's always getting married, or betrothed, or sold off, depending on your level of cynicism. Historians still argue whether most medieval marriages were arranged strictly for economic gain, or if romantic love had its moments too. Most agree the truth falls somewhere between court records and tavern songs. In your village, love is often an afterthought. First come property lines, then oxen counts, then maybe, just maybe, compatibility. You've known couples who've never spoken more than 10 sentences to each other before the wedding. You've known others who steal glances in the middle of market day and smile like they've shared secrets under every moon. You reach the center of town, where an old wooden post still holds the remnants of last week's wedding garland. Brown flowers, wilted herbs, a strip of red cloth that was once bright. You run your hand along the post. You were there. It was cold. The bride wore her mother's gown, and the groom was drunk before noon. They smiled anyway. Sex in marriage is expected, but not discussed. No one tells you what to do. You just do it, or fumble toward it, or in some cases, avoid it altogether. You've heard stories, hushed ones, of girls crying quietly on their wedding night, of men who drink too much ale so they can pretend they forgot. But you've also heard other stories, softer ones. A man who heats a stone for his wife's feet. A woman who saves the best portion of the pottage. A couple who carve tiny hearts into the underside of their shared table. There's a girl across the village who's newly married. She walks differently now, stiffly, carefully. Some say it's just the frost. Others exchange knowing looks. Consent is a word that doesn't get used here. Not because it isn't important, but because it isn't recognized in the way you might hope. The church teaches that a wife's body belongs to her husband. The law agrees. But behind closed doors, things are often more complicated. One man built his wife a small shelf for her combs. Another never touched his second wife because he loved the first too much. A third was beaten by his bride with the broomstick until he started showing up at church sober. You walk past the blacksmiths and catch sight of him and his wife sharing a hunk of meat, real meat, over the fire. She laughs at something he says, mouth half covered. He grins wide, teeth missing, eyes soft. There's no courtly romance here, just fire and food and familiarity. A girl passes you, young and anxious. She's betrothed, you've heard, to a man twice her age with a limp and good teeth. She glances at you like she's asking a question she can't voice. You don't answer. You can't. By mid-morning, the clouds have settled back in. The village goes quiet again. You return home, chew your bread slowly, and sit by the fire until it dies. Then you light it again. The cycle repeats, and later that day you'll see her, the girl from the gathering. She'll smile again, just a little. Enough to feel it, enough to wonder. Love doesn't always bloom in winter, but sometimes it flickers, like a candle with no wick, stubbornly refusing to go out. The afternoon light barely shifts through the low grey sky, as though the sun has forgotten how to rise. You step outside anyway, your breath steaming like kettle mist. The snow has packed down into a crunchy crust, crisscrossed with chicken tracks and boot scars. You pass the neighbor's fence, where icicles dangle like knives from a loose beam. Somewhere down the lane, someone is singing a slow, tuneless ballad, half prayer, half lullaby. You're heading toward the stream, mostly to check if it's thawed, partly because you need to be alone. Inside the cottage, it's too crowded, too many elbows, too many eyes, too many bodies sharing too little air. Outside, there's room to think. As you walk, you think again about what it means to want in a world where desire is rarely yours to name. Romance novels don't exist. Your understanding of passion comes from saints' lives and cautionary tales. And yet, people still find ways to reach for each other. Through gestures, glances, brief touches beneath woolen cloaks. You remember a story told last week around the fire. How someone once got caught behind the mill with the cooper's apprentice. It wasn't scandalous so much as awkward. Mostly because the cooper's apprentice had a habit of narrating everything he did. And apparently that extended beyond barrel making. Historians still argue whether sex before marriage in the medieval period was rare or just rarely recorded. Church documents scold plenty of fornicators, but whether that was the exception or the rule, hard to say. You suspect it happened more than anyone admits. After all, the cold makes people huddle close. The stream is frozen solid, a glassy ribbon winding through the bramble. You throw a pebble and it skips once before cracking through. The sound echoes like a snapped bone. Sex in the medieval world wasn't what we'd call romantic. It was often practical, transactional, scheduled even. Husbands were expected to have sex with their wives to produce heirs, not necessarily to please them. The church was famously obsessed with regulating bedroom behavior. Certain days were forbidden, certain positions frowned upon, and pleasure for its own sake, best not to ask. But people, being people, didn't always follow the rules. There's the apocryphal tale of a friar who confessed he'd read the Song of Songs too many times and ended up carving erotic verses into a wooden spoon. Another tells of a noble woman who bribed a monk to copy her husband's favorite bits from Ovid's Ars Amatoria, illicit manuscripts tucked under mattresses. Lust, it seems, is as timeless as hunger. You sit on a flat rock by the stream, watching your breath swirl and fade. You think about your own body, what it's endured, what it's craved, what it's been denied. You think about the way touch becomes a kind of currency in winter. A warm palm passed across a back, a shared mug of broth, fingers that linger longer than they need to when handing over cloth. Some villagers seek comfort in one another, quietly, carefully, under cloaks in barns, in the lofts of granaries, behind church walls. There are always risks of gossip, of pregnancy, of sin. But the cold makes loneliness feel heavier, sharper. And sometimes proximity wins over piety. You know a woman named Clara who shares her bed with a widow twice her age. No one talks about it directly. But when Clara walks through the village square with fresh bread tucked under her shawl, no one asks how she afforded the flour. In a world this hard, tenderness is its own kind of defiance. You stretch your legs and head back home, the sky deepening to steel. Your fingers ache from the chill. In your pocket is a bit of waxed cloth, meant to patch the roof, but you might repurpose it into a writing surface later. You're not sure what you'd write. A dream, maybe. Or a list of people you wish had touched you differently. As you near the cottage, smoke snakes from the roof hole, promising warmth, if not comfort. Someone inside is laughing. That's rare. You smile to yourself and pick up your pace. For all its coldness, this world still has moments that feel like warmth, flickers, glimmers, reminders that the body, however burdened, still remembers how to hope. The cottage smells of boiled turnip and scorched straw. You duck inside, brushing snow from your shoulders. The fire is doing its best, coals pulsing in a bed of grey ash. But the cold clings to the corners of the room like a jealous ghost. Your cousin is hunched beside the hearth, poking the pot with the iron spoon like it insulted her in a past life. Someone's muttering in their sleep again. You glance toward the corner. Your uncle, the one with the crooked back and questionable memories. He's been known to recite farming advice in Latin at 3 a.m. And last week, he dreamed a rooster stole his boots. No one corrected him. You slide into your usual place, back against the wall, legs tucked under your cloak. As you warm your fingers, your mind drifts again. Not to fantasy, but to reality. To how people actually manage sex and love and everything in between, inside these same cold walls, under these same leaking roofs. Here's the thing about medieval intimacy. Privacy didn't exist. Not really. You probably share this room with 6 or more people, and that's a slow year. Sleeping spaces weren't separate. If a couple wanted to be together, married or not, it happened under thin blankets, amid snoring bodies, creaking beams, and quite possibly livestock. Romance had to be either deeply committed or wildly shameless. Historians still argue whether newlyweds were expected to consummate their marriage in front of witnesses or just under the pressure of knowing everyone knew. Some accounts describe villagers peeking in to confirm the deed. Others insist it was more symbolic. A stocking stolen, a garland hung, a joke made over breakfast. Regardless, discretion was a luxury few could afford. The church, predictably, had opinions about all of this. There were charts, literal medieval charts, detailing which days were acceptable for marital relations. Sundays, forbidden. Feast days, definitely not. Lent, forget it. Fridays, risky, Advent, off limits. If you followed all the rules, you'd be lucky to sneak in a few legal encounters a year. But people, of course, are very good at ignoring charts. You've heard whispered stories about herbalists mixing tinctures. Wild carrot, pennyroyal, mugwort. Contraception wasn't reliable, but it wasn't unknown. Whether for spacing children or avoiding scandal, some women knew which roots to chew and which brews to steep. Whether the men asked or cared is another story. You also think about the girls who didn't get a say. Consent, in many cases, was a footnote. A dowry paid, a handshake made, and a life arranged. Love was not required. Lust was optional. Marriage was a transaction. And if you were lucky, companionship followed. If not, you endured. Some women took matters into their own hands. Nuns wrote poetry. Widows hired scribes to copy love letters. There's even a record of a young woman in 14th century France who broke off her engagement by running away with her lute teacher. Risky, absolutely, but you admire her chutzpah. Then there were the brothels, yes, officially frowned upon, but unofficially tolerated, especially in cities. They were taxed, regulated, sometimes even run by the church, in a perverse little twist of civic irony. Women who worked in them were both condemned and relied upon. They could earn their keep, sometimes even send money home. They wore distinctive headgear to mark them in public. But inside, their roles varied, from exploited workers to unexpected sources of community and medical advice. Your cousin passes you a small bowl of thin stew. You nod thanks and eat slowly. It's more warm than flavorful, but your stomach doesn't care. You chew and think about touch again. How rare it can feel in this world. How powerful a hand on a shoulder becomes when you've spent a day in the cold. How kindness, more than anything else, can carry a charge. Someone at the far end of the room chuckles in their sleep. You imagine a dream, something strange and soft, maybe a face glimpsed in the market, or the memory of fingers tangled in hair. You let yourself smile for a moment. Even now, people dream of each other. Desire doesn't care about firewood or famine. It flickers in the dark, hungry and human. Outside, the wind howls again. You pull your cloak tighter and stare into the hearth. The flames are small but stubborn. Like most things in this world that survive, the fire dies slowly, casting long, shuddering shadows against the crooked walls. You sit with your back to the hearth, spoon resting in your empty bowl, watching steam curl from the stew pot like a ghost trying to escape. The warmth lingers a bit longer tonight, but your thoughts drift back to the thing no one says aloud, and yet everyone lives with. How desire, in this world, must compete with survival. You think of the young couple down the lane, barely more than teenagers. They share a blanket behind the tanner's shop, their fingers always linked when they walk to market. It's sweet, but it's also risky. If her belly swells without a wedding, the entire village will have a field day. Unwed pregnancy was no small matter. In many towns, It meant punishment, public penance, a fine, a shaved head, and if the local priest was particularly strict, weeks of kneeling in church in a rough grey smock, asking God for forgiveness while everyone stared and whispered and judged. Historians still argue whether the church's obsession with virginity came from spiritual ideals or simply the need to control property rights. Because when inheritance is land, paternity must be guaranteed. A woman's body, therefore, became something to be guarded, examined, and legislated. You glance across the room. Your grandmother is asleep again, one arm slung over her face. She married at 15, had her first child within a year, lost 2 others to fever before she turned 20. She's never spoken much about love, but once, after a cider or 2, she said this: marriage is mostly about not freezing, and yet desire still existed, even in the cracks, in the poetry left on church benches, in the etched initials on stable doors, in the slow, secret glances exchanged at saints' festivals. Love found a way, even if the word itself wasn't always spoken. There were seasonal customs too, rituals that blurred the lines between courtship and chaos. In some villages, it was tradition for unmarried men to go bundling, slipping into a young woman's bed with permission, often under supervision, sometimes with a bundling board between them. The idea, in theory, was to foster affection without contact. In practice, well, you can imagine how well that worked. And May Day, oh, May Day was something else entirely. Even the clergy braced themselves. Couples disappeared into the woods. Garlands were made. Fertility rites danced dangerously close to scandal. But the arrival of spring brought its own madness, and sometimes the elders just looked away. Your uncle shifts in his sleep and mutters something about rabbits. You blink, then snort softly. Fitting. You think about intimacy again. Not the kind from troubadour songs or illuminated manuscripts, but the raw, imperfect kind. The kind that happens despite lice, despite frozen toes, despite the smell of cabbage and wet wool. The kind that's stolen between chores, or behind hay bales, or under a shared cloak. Not elegant, not poetic, but deeply human. One story comes back to you, told by a traveling peddler who came through last autumn. He claimed that in certain parts of the Low Countries, lovers used to trade kiss tokens, embroidered cloth squares, scented with herbs and stitched with private messages. A token tucked into a sleeve might say more than words ever could. You wish you had one now. Just for the scent. Just for the memory of touch. It's hard to feel romantic when the roof leaks and your shift smells like turnips. But sometimes, in the quiet moments, between the coughing fits and the clatter of pots, there's a flicker of softness. Someone offers you the last piece of bread. Someone remembers how you take your broth. Someone doesn't comment on your hair when you haven't washed it in a week. And when 2 people share a bed, not out of necessity but choice, that can mean everything. You rise slowly, stretching until your joints pop like snapping twigs. You move to the window, just a square of oiled parchment fitted into a warped frame, and peer into the dark. Snow falls again, heavy and quiet. The sky is the color of pewter, and the earth sleeps beneath it, shivering and still. You press your hand against the window pane, cold, but real, like everything else. In this world, sex isn't sacred or sinful. It's ordinary, muddled, complicated, sometimes joyful, sometimes painful, sometimes both. You turn away from the window and crawl back beneath the blanket. A body shifts beside you. Maybe your sister, maybe the chicken. You can't tell, and you're too tired to care. And slowly, as the wind whistles and the rafters groan, you fall asleep. Still breathing, still dreaming, still human. The sun rises late, smeared behind thick clouds, like a candle behind a fogged-up glass. You stir, slowly and reluctantly, pushing your face free from the shared blanket, which smells, unfortunately, exactly like what it is. A blend of wool, sweat, and generational fatigue. Your limbs ache, not with sickness, but with the dull weight of routine. Another day, another fire to coax, another round of scraping, fetching, and not dying. You rub your eyes and glance at the others still asleep. 3 people, 1 bed. A child sprawled sideways. Someone's toe in your ribs. This, you think, is probably the least sexy sleeping arrangement in human history. But you also know it's normal. Medieval homes weren't built for privacy. Entire families, sometimes more than one, shared a single-room cottage. Grandparents, babies, and everything in between. So if you were hoping for candlelight and lacy curtains, sorry. In real life, intimacy was rarely private, and often it wasn't even particularly quiet, just muffled under a pile of hay and the vague embarrassment of being overheard. Still, people found ways. You remember your neighbor whispering that she and her husband used to sneak out to the barn. Not for chores, for a moment alone. The hay itched, she said, and the cows were judgy. But at least no one interrupted. Historians still argue whether medieval couples had affectionate marriages or merely functional ones. The truth, of course, is complicated. Some unions were arranged and loveless. Others grew tender with time. A few, lucky or not, sparked with passion from the start and kept it, despite everything. You throw on your outer tunic, deep russet, patched at the elbows, and tug on your boots, still damp from yesterday's trudge. As you lace them, you recall a snippet from the church sermon last week. Lust is the devil's forge. The priest had bellowed it 3 times, each louder than the last. But the same priest also fathered 2 children with the laundress, and nobody really brings it up anymore. The church had a complicated relationship with sex. On one hand, it preached celibacy and purity. On the other, it reluctantly accepted that married couples were allowed to, well, do the deed, so long as it was for procreation. No fun, no Sunday mornings, no creative arrangements. Missionary only, thank you very much. And never during Lent or Advent or on feast days or Fridays, or Wednesdays, or whenever the moon looked suspicious. You stand, stretch, and wander toward the door, passing the hearth, which is just embers again. You're not even mad, just resigned. The cold greets you like an overly familiar friend. The sky is still the color of steel wool. Down the path, the butcher's wife is already shouting at someone. Maybe her husband, maybe the pigs. Either way, it's loud and passionate. More noise than most couples here make during actual intimacy. It reminds you that for some, passion showed up in arguments. Others expressed it through gifts. Like the cobbler who once carved a heart into his wife's shoe sole, even though no one else would ever see it. Quiet affection had to squeeze itself into strange corners of daily life. You pass a low stone fence and spot a couple talking by the well. He hands her a clay pot. She smiles. It's small, but you recognize it. A moment. The kind of moment people miss if they're not paying attention. There's an old superstition, still whispered in the villages, that sharing bread with someone at dawn binds your spirits. Not legally, not biblically, but deeply. The kind of bond that makes a person think of you, even when their hands are chapped and their back is breaking. Romantic, in a muddy, frostbitten sort of way. You pause to help a child gather kindling. He grins at you, missing 3 teeth, and points to a bird overhead. They say ravens mate for life, he says. Without prompt or context, you nod solemnly. Who knows if it's true? But the way he says it feels important. There were rules in place, you know. Strange, specific ones. A woman caught being unfaithful might be paraded through the streets in nothing but a shift, with a basket of stones tied to her back. A man, meanwhile, might face a fine, or nothing at all. Justice tilted on gender. No surprise there. But there were also love tokens exchanged. Ribbon scraps, embroidered sleeves, silver pins. Things given with trembling hands and kept under mattresses, hidden from the harshness of life. Historians still argue whether courtly love was a real cultural force or mostly the invention of bored noblemen with access to too many scrolls. But even peasants carved hearts into trees, etched initials into the mud with sticks, and snuck out after dark for reasons that had nothing to do with firewood. You glance toward the woods and imagine 2 silhouettes disappearing into the trees. Just for a moment. Just to breathe. Just to feel like people instead of pieces of labor. And maybe tonight, you'll dream of something warm. Not stew, not blankets, but something with hands, with closeness, with meaning. For now, you return to your cottage, close the door behind you, and shake off the frost. The fire's gone out again. You smile faintly. Some things, like desire and embers, must be coaxed back to life. You find yourself sweeping the hearth with a straw broom that barely qualifies as a broom. It's more of a bound bundle of regrets. Still, it pushes the ash aside, and that feels like progress. Your mind wanders, as it often does during these quiet chores, to the ways people filled their time, when they weren't hauling, scrubbing, or freezing. The cottage walls are thin, but gossip is thinner. You hear your neighbors through the cracks, through the walls, even through their dreams. And what do they talk about? Who's expecting? Who's been sneaking off? Who's sharing someone else's blanket? In a world without privacy, secrets still bloom like mushrooms in damp corners. You smile to yourself, because even now, people act surprised by the pregnancies, as if the mechanics were still a mystery. But medieval sex ed, if you can call it that, was a mess of superstition, whispered lore, and church-approved vagueness. The midwife down the lane, old Isolde, swears that sneezing after the act keeps a woman from conceiving. A local priest once insisted that sex facing westward summoned demons. And your cousin Gerwin, he's convinced a rabbit's foot under the bed guarantees twins. Historians still argue whether the average peasant woman truly believed these things or merely repeated them out of habit, like charms against the unpredictable. After all, medieval medicine was deeply entangled with magic. Fertility was a field plowed equally by prayer and guesswork. You throw the ash into a wooden bucket and turn back to the pot, where last night's stew has congealed into something that might be edible again, with enough heat and forgiveness. The smell is not exactly romantic, but hunger dulls a lot of concerns. Sex and survival were linked, but not in the dreamy candlelit way you'd see in a tapestry. Pregnancy was both a miracle and a warning. Another mouth to feed, another chance of death in childbirth, another sleepless year on an already splintered bed. And yet, love, or at least physical closeness, persisted. In stables, in haylofts, behind barns, under stars. You once saw two teenagers stealing a moment by the smithy, hidden poorly, kissing like they had only 5 seconds left on earth. Maybe they did. Maybe they just understood urgency better than most. You clean the pot out with snow and scrub the spoon with a scrap of linen. You hear a snore from the sleeping mat. Your grandmother, deep in slumber again, mumbling something about her 4th husband. You've never met any of them, but the way she tells it, at least one was a redhead and 2 were surprisingly decent dancers. Marriage wasn't always a grand affair. In fact, it could be as simple as saying vows in front of witnesses, often without priests involved. Rings weren't guaranteed, nor were celebrations. Sometimes the feast was just yesterday's bread and the luxury of going to bed early without a baby crying in the corner. You sit at the edge of your bed box and glance at the window shutter. Outside, the snow is softening. You think back to what your friend Edda said, how her husband once left her a single plum in summer, wrapped in a twist of cloth. He'd saved it from the market, hidden it in the hay, and gave it to her on the night their first child was born. That plum, she said, tasted like everything good she'd forgotten existed. Intimacy wasn't about frequency. It was about fragments. A look, a touch, a stolen hour after dark. You remember a traveling minstrel who sang a bawdy song about a knight and a dairymaid. He was nearly run out of town for it. Not because it was filthy, but because it was too close to home. My truth was, the body wasn't always sacred, but it was always necessary. And needing someone, physically, emotionally, wasn't always safe, but it was always real. You hear children laughing outside, and for a moment it lifts something in your chest. Then comes a shriek. Then silence. Then the slow whimper of someone who's just realized their snowball had a rock in it. You shake your head and poke at the fire again, coaxing it into something resembling flame. The warmth is minimal, but the symbolism? Profound. In winter, even a little heat means survival. Even a brief touch, even a quiet night with someone breathing beside you, means you're still part of the living. You recall that one tale told around the fire, of a noble woman who fell in love with a scribe. They met in secret for years, passing notes hidden in religious texts. Eventually, they were caught, of course. He was banished. She was sent to a convent. But the story insists they each kept one half of a torn letter, buried inside the linings of their sleeves until the end. You're not sure it's true, but it's worth believing. And in this life, belief, like desire, is a kind of fuel. The stew bubbles again, and you let it. You sit back, arms around your knees, breath curling in front of you, and you wonder who's sneaking off tonight. Who's braving the cold for a touch of warmth? You. Not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Maybe when the fire holds longer. Maybe when spring returns. The snow has thickened into a grey slush by mid-morning, and your boots squelch with every step. They're stuffed with straw, or what's left of it, and you try not to think about the chill slowly claiming your toes. You trudge toward the back pasture, supposedly to check on the fence line, but mostly just to clear your head. The cottage feels full of bodies, of coughs, of thoughts that don't have room to stretch. And as you walk, you think about how even in a world this cold, this coarse, there was always some kind of burning underneath. Not always love, not always longing, sometimes just want. And that was enough. Desire wasn't whispered behind locked doors. It was whistled in fields, passed in songs, scratched into the underside of benches. In medieval villages, there were no bedrooms with privacy, no alone time. You learned to share space, even the intimate kind. And when you didn't, everyone noticed. Then they talked. Historians still argue whether rural communities were genuinely scandalized by unwed trysts or simply annoyed when those trysts disrupted church attendance. But what's clear is this: everyone was watching, because everyone was bored, and because gossip made the world feel warmer. You reach the fence. A bird startles from the posts. You rub your hands together and think of last year's midsummer fair, when the traveling puppet show accidentally performed a scene too risque for the priest's taste. He turned purple. The puppeteer shrugged. A week later, they were married. Not the priest and the puppeteer, heavens no. The puppeteer and the baker's niece, who'd found the play delightfully accurate. There's no denying that medieval life was often transactional. A dowry here, a patch of land there. But affection, that wasn't a guarantee. It was a bonus. You knew couples who barely spoke, who worked together, slept beside each other, raised 3 children, and exchanged exactly one kiss you ever witnessed. And even that may have been accidental. But then, you also knew pairs who grinned at each other like they shared a secret language, who stole touches when they thought no one was looking, who slipped out of Mass early just to share a moment in the chapel garden. Love wasn't absent. It just had to make do with bad food and cold floors. You walked the fence line slowly, watching the ox in the distance exhale steam like a worn-out bellows. In the barn, a pair of stable hands giggle through the boards. You roll your eyes, then smile. Youth doesn't wait for comfort or discretion. Among the upper classes, of course, things looked different. Marriage among nobles was more about land than affection. A woman might be sent to live with her husband's family as young as 12. A man might not see his wife for months if campaigns or courtly duties pulled him away. So what happened in the meantime? The same thing that always happens. People got lonely and people got creative. In royal courts, there were poems and flirtations, courtly love, coded gestures, handkerchiefs tied to belt loops, sonnets murmured behind fans. Sometimes it stayed symbolic, sometimes it didn't. And when it didn't, the church frowned, nobles gossiped, and children with questionable paternity got very quiet titles. You reach a patch of earth where the snow is thinner and squat down to examine a fallen branch. Your breath curls above it. It's cracked, useless for building, but dry enough to burn. You pocket it. People forget that medieval society was governed as much by sin as it was by law. Everything had a moral weight. Lust, modesty, even where you sat at dinner. The church tried to shape behavior, preaching abstinence before marriage and fidelity after. But in practice, there was plenty of bending, one of the oddest rules. It wasn't just the act of sex that mattered, it was how you did it. Missionary position was preferred. Anything else risked suspicion, or worse, condemnation. Certain days were also off limits. Feast days, fast days, Sundays, days ending in day. It was hard to keep track, and yet people persisted. Because people always do. Because when you're cold, hungry, and unsure what tomorrow holds, even fleeting closeness becomes sacred. A shared body, a shared breath. You stand, stretch your back, and turn toward the woodshed. The wind picks up, slicing across your cheeks like a reprimand. You cover your nose with the end of your scarf and trudge on. You remember the story of Thomas and Alice. He was a tanner, she was the miller's daughter. They met beside the river, year after year, until one spring they stopped returning home. Weeks passed. Then one day, a new couple showed up in a distant village, claiming to be from over the hills. Nobody asked questions. Everyone knew. You pass the edge of your field and glance up at the hill beyond. A crow watches from a tree, head tilted, suspicious. You nod at it. It does not nod back. Back inside the cottage, the room smells like old onions and newer hope. Your grandmother is awake, muttering something about a neighbor's scandal from 2 decades past. You nod along, not because you remember it, but because repetition makes her happy. You reach for the stew again, warming the dregs. As it simmers, you think about how bodies, yours, theirs, were both temples and tools. Tired, imperfect, but still capable of softness, still capable of stories. And some stories, even in a world made of ash and frost, begin with a single glance across a hayfield and end with a whispered name before sleep. The fire pops softly as the stew finishes reheating, the aroma settling over the room like a worn cloak. You cradle the bowl carefully, its warmth bites at your palms, but you welcome the sting. Another bowl, another meal, somehow still here. And maybe it's the heat loosening your thoughts, or maybe it's just this ongoing winter haze, but your mind drifts again. This time not to secret romances or stolen glances, but to what happened when love and sex became more than just casual arrangements, when the stakes were higher, when the church, the law, and the village all had something to say. Marriage in the medieval world wasn't sealed with rings and flower petals. It was, in many cases, sealed with a handshake, a witness, and sometimes just mutual consent spoken aloud. I take you as my wife. I take you as my husband. And boom, you were married, at least in the eyes of the church. Historians still argue whether formal ceremonies were the exception or the rule, especially among the lower classes. But what's clear is that legitimacy could hinge on a spoken promise whispered in a field, which sounds romantic, until you realize it also made breaking that promise heartbreakingly easy. You set the empty bowl aside, careful not to wake the cousin snoring beside the hearth, and shift your focus to the flickering flame. The church encouraged sex within marriage. It was, after all, for procreation. But that didn't mean it encouraged pleasure. In fact, pleasure was suspect, suspicious, dangerous, a temptation best avoided. Think of the children, but only think of them when you were actually trying to make them. Yet the line was fuzzy. A married couple could technically enjoy themselves, as long as they didn't enjoy it too much. There were whole confession manuals written to help priests grill parishioners about the purity of their acts. Were they done in the dark? On the right day? Without excessive joy? Congratulations, you might be in the clear. Sin was often measured in centimeters and timing. You shift slightly, wrapping the cloak tighter around your shoulders. A draft sneaks through a crack in the shutters and rattles the tin cup on the table. Somewhere outside, a dog barks, sharp, twice, then gone. Sharp. Let's talk about what happened when things didn't follow the approved path. Because they rarely did. A pregnancy outside of marriage wasn't just awkward. It was a crisis. Families scrambled to marry daughters off quickly, or quietly disappear them for a season. Sometimes the father stepped up. Sometimes he denied everything. In some towns, there were public rituals to shame unmarried mothers. In others, they were simply whispered about for the next 20 years. But not every illicit relationship ended in scandal. Some became long-term arrangements, quietly acknowledged by the community. The church might have frowned, but neighbors had other concerns, like whether the grain would survive the frost. Morality didn't always win against hunger and weather. You think of Marjorie, the blacksmith's sister, who'd had 2 children out of order, as your grandmother puts it. Everyone knew. No one stopped buying her candles. Her boys grew up strong, and her bread never burned. That counted for more than wedding bells. And while we're here, yes, midwives knew about herbs, about roots and seeds that could end a pregnancy if taken at the right time. It was risky, dangerous, often passed down in hushed tones and careful hands. But women shared what they knew because they had to, because there were few other choices and fewer protections. You rise, stretch your arms, and pace the length of the cottage. Your feet are numb, your back aches, but movement feels good. You pause at the window, peer out. The snow has softened, falling slow now, like the sky is tired too. In noble households, scandal was currency. A lady caught in an affair could end up in a convent. A man caught dallying with a maid might be dismissed or promoted, depending on whom he offended. One of the strangest documents to survive from the time is a noblewoman's prayer, asking for forgiveness for loving her husband too carnally. Even affection between spouses was occasionally suspect, especially if it distracted from religious devotion. And yet, love did bloom. In poetry, in songs, in the quiet moments between duties. Courtly love may have been a game for the elite, but its language trickled down. You once heard a shepherd recite a stanza to his sweetheart under the old elm. It wasn't good, but it was heartfelt, and that made it powerful. Historians still debate how common it was for love to factor into marriages. Some argue that affection often followed duty rather than preceded it. Others point to surviving letters between couples, tender, longing, sometimes explicitly emotional. So maybe the heart found a way. Even when the world tried to keep it buried under layers of wool, law, and piety, you sit again, back cracking, and poke at the fire with a stick that was once part of a chair. Sparks rise. You think of the things never written down, of stolen kisses in shadowed corners, of hands held too long, of laughter shared beneath thick quilts. Sex in the medieval world was never just one thing. It was survival, obligation, rebellion, comfort, desperation, connection. It happened in castles and cottages, in fields and behind barns, in fear and in joy, and it always carried consequences. Sometimes children, sometimes whispers, sometimes just a memory that warmed one lonely night. You close your eyes for a moment. The fire snaps again, louder this time. Someone stirs nearby. A chicken clucks softly in its sleep, and you breathe in. Smoke, straw, something vaguely herbal. The world doesn't smell clean, but it smells real. Outside, the wind howls. Inside, Life continues. Morning slips by without ceremony. Just a slow shift in the tone of grey filtering through the shutters. No bells ring. No rooster crows. The sky merely lightens. And that's how you know. Another day has begun. You're still alive. Still cold. Still vaguely sore in places that probably shouldn't be sore. You brush off your knees and stand. Joints grumbling like old gate hinges. There's stew left, if you can call it that. Now more congealed than liquid, with a film on top that shines slightly in the light. You scrape it into a bowl and sit by the hearth, chewing slowly. It tastes persistent. Your thoughts, maybe because you're half awake and full of salt, drift back again. To bodies, to control, to the strange ways medieval society regulated sex, not just with laws and sermons, but with silence and superstition. Because if the church couldn't see you, and your neighbors didn't talk about you, maybe it didn't happen. Maybe it wasn't sin. Maybe it was just Tuesday. Sex outside marriage wasn't just frowned upon. It could be punished. Harshly. Public penance, fines, whippings, even exile in some towns. One town in England had a scold's bridle, a cruel, metal contraption that locked over the head and mouth to punish women accused of promiscuity or gossip. And yes, historians still argue whether it was actually used as often as records claim, or if the threat alone was enough to keep mouths and bodies under control. Still, the church's reach didn't always go as far as it wanted. In remote villages like yours, enforcement was spotty at best. Priests had limited time, and sin was abundant. People got creative. Couples who couldn't afford marriage fees might live together in sin for years before saving enough to make it official. Others quietly eloped, declared vows to each other, and hoped no one challenged them. And then there were brothels, legal, taxed, and sometimes church supervised. Yep, you stir your stew thoughtfully, remembering that detail from something the merchant's apprentice once whispered while hauling sacks of barley. In many cities, prostitution was considered a necessary evil. Better for men to visit professionals, said the church, than to corrupt virtuous women. Of course, no one asked the women how virtuous they wanted to be. A fringe practice existed too, stranger still. Some medieval men swore oaths of celibacy, not for spiritual reasons, but as a form of male bonding or public piety. Virgin nights, they were sometimes called, especially in tales and songs. Whether these vows were kept is another story. Historians aren't sure how literal to take the records, or if virgin just meant too broke to impress a lady. And then there's the bedding ceremony. Ah yes. Nothing says welcome to marriage like an audience. In many regions, especially among the well-to-do, a newlywed couple was led to bed by their families, and sometimes neighbors, cheered on, and occasionally witnessed in their first moments as husband and wife. Clothes on, most of the time, but still intimate. Much. It was less about pleasure, more about proof. Proof of union. Proof of consummation. proof that the contract was sealed. You adjust your cloak and toss another log on the fire, one of the ones that still smells faintly of goat dung. The flame catches, and the smoke twists up toward the dark beams overhead, curling around the rafters like a lazy spirit. When pregnancy did happen, and oh it did, the rules changed. A pregnant woman wasn't supposed to have sex, not for moral reasons, but practical ones. Doctors, if you could call them that, warned that intercourse during pregnancy could harm the baby or distract the mother's humors. Yes, humors. The ancient system of bodily fluids that medieval medicine clung to like a comforting myth. And let's not forget the folklore. Folk beliefs held that conceiving under the wrong stars could produce a child with deformities. That babies inherited not just physical traits, but emotions from the moment of conception. Too much lust. Your child might grow up wild. Too much sadness. They might be fragile of heart. One text even warned against conceiving during a thunderstorm. Lightning, apparently, made for angry children. You shift your gaze to the shuttered window. Outside, snow still drifts, piling gently against the base of the fence. You think of your neighbors, those huddled against similar fires, living similar lives, having similar thoughts. Sex wasn't just a private act. It was a public reckoning. It shaped families, inheritance, and sometimes entire village politics. And when it went wrong, it could break everything. A noble caught with a servant might lose land, title, even his head. A woman accused of witchcraft could be punished for seduction just as harshly as spellcasting. Love potions? Real. Or at least real enough to get someone burned if they were found in the wrong hands. But even in the darkest corners, affection found a way. You remember hearing about a couple down in the valley, two women, living together, calling each other cousins, but sharing a roof, a field, and a life for over 30 winters. People whispered, but no one intervened. Maybe because they kept to themselves, maybe because the village knew and simply accepted. There were no parades, no declarations, just quiet endurance. Sex, love, and survival intertwined like threads in an old wool blanket. Scratched, stretched, still holding. You close your eyes a moment, and the fire's warmth becomes a blanket of its own. Your breath slows. Somewhere behind you, someone coughs and turns in their sleep. The world is still here. So are you. So are her. And in this medieval quiet, in this stew-scented, wool-wrapped hush, you realize something simple. The rules were many, the risks were high, and yet, somehow, people still reached for each other in the dark, because even in winter, even in sin, even when the world said no, warmth was worth the risk. You hear it before you feel it. Someone shifting nearby, the creak of rope and straw beneath another body. A sigh follows, low and resigned. Then silence again. The kind of silence that only happens when everyone is too cold or too tired to bother complaining. The fire is still holding. Barely. You shuffle closer and poke at it with the charred end of a stick. Nudging embers like they're old friends, You're trying to annoy it back to life. A small flame flickers up, golden and feeble, and you exhale in relief. You think again about what intimacy meant back then. It wasn't roses and poetry. It wasn't slow music or private bedrooms. No. In your world, intimacy is a shared blanket, a whispered joke in the dark, a stolen moment when everyone else is too busy coughing or chewing to notice. Privacy, that's a foreign concept. The idea that two people might be left entirely alone, just the two of them, is almost laughable. You live, sleep, eat, and argue within earshot of half your extended family. Romance, if it comes at all, has to squeeze itself between daily survival and communal space. Still, the need is there. Always. People carve out what time they can. Behind hayricks, in corners of fields, in barns that smell strongly of livestock and slightly of sin. And sometimes that's enough. Not that it's all joyful secrecy. In some places, husbands had legal rights, not just to their wives' labor, but their bodies too. Marital consent wasn't a given, it was presumed. Theologians wrote long treatises on the duty of spouses to fulfill one another's needs. Conjugal debt, they called it. If a wife refused too often, she could be punished. Not by law necessarily, but by reputation, by exclusion, or worse, by her own priest during confession. And it wasn't just straight couples. Though records are sparse, they exist. Cases of men arrested for sodomy, women accused of unnatural acts. Punishments range from fines to execution. Yet the fact these acts happened enough to warrant records says something. Desire existed in all forms, even in an era desperate to crush it into a singular mold. You pull your cloak tighter around your shoulders and glance toward the corner where your grandmother is asleep, still bundled beneath the burlap. Her breathing is slow, steady. You wonder what she knew in her youth, what secrets she kept, what compromises she made. Did she marry for love? Doubtful. Most didn't. Marriages were alliances, agreements, exchanges. Love was a luxury, one you might hope for after the fact. If it came, wonderful. If not, well, the pottage still had to be stirred, the goats milked, the children raised. Of course, that didn't stop people from trying. Love did find its way in, through glances, through touches, through letters when writing was a rare skill, and a scrawled note meant more than a sack of silver. There are accounts of peasants walking miles to see someone they admired, of small gifts exchanged, a wooden ring, a ribbon, a carved urn. And in rare cases, there were love matches. Not often, but enough that they still show up in the records. Enough that ballads were written. Enough that people kept hoping, even when they married for land and stayed for obligation. You sip from a wooden cup, the water inside slightly warm from its place near the fire. It tastes smoky, but that's better than frozen. The fire crackles softly. A few others begin to stir. Someone coughs. Someone mutters something about the goat. Day is arriving again, like it always does. Reluctantly, you think too of the role midwives played in all this, not just as birth attendants, but as keepers of knowledge, herbal remedies, fertility advice, love charms. Some were whispered to help encourage conception, others whispered more urgently to prevent it. Birth control wasn't unheard of. It just wasn't spoken of publicly. Poultices, drinks, rituals. Some of them worked, some didn't. But they represented something vital. Choice. Or at least the desire for it. There were even texts, written in secret, shared with care, that detailed methods for timing, for herbs to induce menstruation, for plants that might discourage pregnancy. Pennyroyal, rue, mugwort, dangerous herbs, but in desperate hands, they became lifelines. Yet, as always, power decided how the story was told. A noble woman experimenting with herbs might be seen as learned. A peasant woman doing the same, a witch. And with that accusation came fire, rope, or drowning. Historians still argue whether the witch trials were driven more by fear of sex, fear of women, or fear of independence itself. Maybe it was all of the above. You press your hands near the fire again, feeling the slight sting of heat returning to frozen fingertips. Somewhere outside, a rooster crows. Late, as usual. You smile slightly, despite yourself. Sex in your time isn't something you talk about freely. Not unless you're a drunk at the tavern or a priest behind the safety of the pulpit. But you think about it. Everyone does. You wonder what's normal, what's dangerous, what's allowed, and what might happen if you reach too far. Still, for all its rules and risks, you know this. Warmth is scarce, and connection even scarcer. If you find it, even for a moment, even under layers of wool and straw and fear, you hold on to it. Because survival isn't just about bread and firewood, it's about touch, about closeness, about knowing that someone, somewhere, still sees you as more than another sack of bones to haul through the winter. You reach for another stick of wood and feed the fire. The room glows again. The fire pops quietly as a twig snaps in half, curling into embers. You watch the glow crawl across the log like a lazy beetle, and for a moment, it's almost peaceful. Then a draft slips under the door, tugging at the edge of your blanket like an impatient ghost, and the cold returns. Your thoughts drift again, as they tend to in the long quiet between chores, and you think about how the church tried to guide and contain every flicker of human desire. Sex, in your world, isn't just personal. It's moral, spiritual, political. Every touch is weighed, every act judged. Not always out loud, but always somewhere. By the priest, by the neighbors, by whatever part of you absorbed the sermons about sin before you could even spell the word. Church doctrine says sex is for procreation, full stop. Anything else, even inside a marriage, is suspect. Pleasure is tolerated at best, discouraged at worst. You remember a sermon once. The priest used the phrase, animal lust, as though wanting someone made you less human. You were maybe 10 at the time. The room was cold then too. But of course, that didn't stop people. It never does. People in your world still found ways to express longing, even if it came with guilt baked in. There are records of confessionals filled with apologies about temptation, dreams, self-touching, monks writing elaborate treatises about purity, while secretly penning love poetry in the margins of religious texts. Historians still argue whether some of those marginal drawings were simply satire or deeply repressed desires scratching their way onto the page. You once saw one, an illustration of a nun, lifting her skirts, chasing after a monk with a fish on a leash. You didn't understand it at the time. You're still not sure you do, but it's stuck in your brain. Like a burr, there are whispers too, of how sexuality expressed itself in ways beyond the body. Courtly love, for instance, a medieval phenomenon where knights pledged devotion to unattainable women, pouring their longing into songs, poems, and highly stylized sighs. Real sex was out of reach, so they wrapped desire in metaphor and chivalry. Love as performance, passion as poetry. Still, that didn't mean people were chaste. Far from it, especially in cities where anonymity made room for indulgence. Brothels were not only tolerated, they were taxed. In some towns, red lanterns hung above legal houses of prostitution, and the women working inside were called public women. They had rules to follow. No gaudy clothing, no walking near churches, no soliciting after curfew. But they existed. Their presence acknowledged something the church rarely admitted out loud. People had needs. You poke at the coals again, thinking of how those women were viewed, simultaneously scorned and relied upon, necessary and vilified. Some were trafficked, some chose the work, some fell into it by poverty, by widowhood, by bad luck. Few got out. There were rules about where they could live, what they could wear. In London, they had to wear striped hoods. In Paris, yellow veils, marked always. And yet they had power in a way, knowledge of bodies, of leverage, of survival. You lean back against the wall, the stone cool even through your cloak. Across the room, someone shifts in their sleep, pulling the shared blanket tighter. You envy them the dreams. Your own dreams, when they come, tend to be strange collages, part desire, part fear. That tension never leaves. Wanting something, but not being allowed to. Being told your body belongs to God, or to your husband, or to your father's contract. Sometimes, when you draw water from the well and catch your reflection, you wonder how many of your wants are really yours, and how many are learned. Did that market girl you stared at notice your eyes? Would she have smiled if you'd spoken? Or would she have pulled away, quick, cautious, scanning the street for judgment? Desire is dangerous in your time, not just for the soul but for the body. A wrong look, a wrong move, and you could be branded, punished, accused. A woman caught loose could lose her standing, her prospects, even her safety. A man caught in forbidden acts could face the stocks, or worse. And yet, in quiet corners, in brief touches, people find ways to meet, to speak, to connect. Even among the rigid roles and harsh penalties, people sneak in warmth. A secret rendezvous behind the mill. A flirtation during laundry day. A hand brushed just a second too long. As someone passes you a pail, you smile slightly at the memory of one such moment. It wasn't much. A shared chore, a shared grin. But for that second, you felt seen. It's funny. With all the restrictions, you might think people would lose interest. But repression seems to ferment longing. Where there's firewood, there's smoke. And where there's smoke, there's always someone fanning it with a prayer they only half mean. The fire in front of you flares for a moment, sparked by a fresh knot of sap. You blink, momentarily dazzled by the sudden orange, and the room looks sharper. Every crack in the walls, every thread in the fabric, every line on your hands. You reach for a crust of bread, not much, but enough, and chew slowly. It's dry, but filling. You think again of all the stories you've heard. Lovers disguised as pilgrims, messages hidden in loaves, bed linens used to signal secret meetings. Love, lust, longing. They all persisted, bending around the rules like vines around stone. And the stone rarely noticed. But the vines kept climbing. Outside, snowflakes tapped the shutter like fingernails. You listen. The world hasn't changed. Not really. People still want what they're not supposed to. And sometimes they still get it. You sit back and watch the fire. Your breath rising in slow, even clouds. The night deepens, but your mind stays restless. That's the problem with winter. Too much time to think, not enough to do. You shift under the weight of the blanket. Well, technically a pile of garments pretending to be one, and listen to the wind nudge against the cottage walls. You can almost hear it whispering secrets from long dead winters. You think again about what sex meant in your world. Not just the act, but the ripple it created through every part of life. Because in the medieval mind, sex wasn't a private hobby. It was legal territory, political currency, and social glue. It defined inheritance, land, rank, honor, and often it decided your entire future before you even reached puberty. Marriages weren't always arranged, but they were almost always strategic. Love came later, if at all. What mattered was property, alliance, and offspring. You might marry a near stranger your father selected during harvest. Maybe a widower twice your age, maybe your cousin, especially if land was involved. And when you did marry, you were expected to perform your duties. Yes, those duties. In public view, sex was for children. In private, it was often a quiet ritual, a candle stub still burning, straw ticking creaking, a whispered prayer that no one was watching through the thatch. Medieval law codes even legislated what was and wasn't allowed between married couples. Missionary position only. No intimacy on Sundays, or Fridays, or during Lent, or Advent, or on Saint Days, or before Mass, or after. So, very few days actually. Historians still argue whether these rules were strictly enforced or just enthusiastically ignored by bored villagers. There's a story you once heard about a noble woman who wrote to a bishop complaining that her husband insisted on unnatural methods. The bishop's reply? A 40-day fast and a pilgrimage for the husband, and maybe the wife too, just to be safe. That's the thing. The rules were often vague, but the shame was specific, especially if you were a woman. If a child was born outside of marriage, the consequences could be severe. For the mother, certainly. The father, well, maybe, depending on who he was. And while laws varied wildly across Europe, the pattern was clear. Sex outside marriage was dangerous. Adultery could be punished by public whipping, branding, or exile. In some towns, a woman caught cheating might be forced to ride a donkey backward through the village, wearing a bonnet of reeds, a performance of disgrace. Still, people found loopholes. Hand fasting, for instance, was a sort of trial marriage common in parts of the British Isles. A couple would pledge themselves to each other before witnesses, sometimes for a year and a day. If they still liked each other at the end, great. If not, they'd part ways. It wasn't always legally binding, but it was socially recognized, and it gave people room to explore. You pull the blanket tighter. There's a draft coming up through the floorboards now. A reminder that, like everything else, sex in winter was harder, literally and metaphorically. Between the layers of wool and the freezing temperatures, spontaneous romance wasn't exactly easy to come by. And yet, somehow, people still managed. Maybe that's why storytelling was so rich. Myths, poems, fables. They gave people permission to think about longing, even when they couldn't act on it. Like that old Breton tale about the knight who fell in love with the snow spirit. They met only during the coldest nights, and every time he kissed her, she melted a little more. By spring, she was gone. Romantic, tragic, symbolic, and probably based on someone's very real winter frustration. You can't help but chuckle softly. Some things never change. Then there are the songs. Oh, the songs. Naughty rhymes and tavern ballads pass between workers and scullery maids, soldiers and shepherds. Many of them couldn't be repeated in front of a priest, but that didn't stop anyone from singing them behind his back. Even respected poets dabbled in double entendre. Geoffrey Chaucer's tales, for example, are famously full of side eyes, bed tricks, and anatomical puns. Middle English has never sounded so cheeky. And let's not forget the remedies. Aphrodisiacs were big business in your time. Dried fox genitals, powdered mandrake root, goat's milk infused with basil and crushed pearl. Some were rooted in ancient texts, others less so. There's even a recipe involving pickled beetles and egg yolks, guaranteed supposedly to summon Venus's favor. Whether it worked, debatable, but it gave people hope. And sometimes that was enough. You think again of the village midwife. She probably knew more about sex, birth, and everything between than any man in town. Yet she wasn't seen as powerful, just necessary. Her knowledge was both respected and feared. The line between healer and heretic was dangerously thin. If a labor went badly, or a child was born with a strange mark, people whispered. Superstition filled every silence science hadn't reached yet. And when people couldn't explain something, they blamed sin. Crops failed? Someone must be sleeping with the wrong person. Livestock died. Someone must be cursed. A woman smiled too freely. Definitely a temptress. Definitely dangerous. Even dreams weren't safe. Night emissions were seen as signs of demonic interference. A monk might wake up ashamed and rush to confession, convinced that an incubus had paid him a visit. Scholars wrote entire manuals on how to sleep without being tempted, even recommending sleeping on cold stone floors to avoid stirring the flesh. You, on the other hand, just wanted a mattress without straw mites. You stretch slightly, feeling the joints in your back protest. The fire is down to faint glow now, just enough to cast long shadows on the walls. One of them shifts. It's just someone rolling over, but it makes the hairs on your arms stand. Sex in the medieval world wasn't just about touch. It was about power, about rules, about control. It seeped into everything: law, religion, culture. It told people who they could be, what they could want, and what price they might pay for wanting too much. You close your eyes, feeling the cold creep back in, but your thoughts stay warm. Not from passion, but from the quiet, secret knowing that even in the harshest winters, desire still stirred, carefully, quietly, but always. The wind has softened, just slightly, and in the hush, you hear someone in the cottage breathing deeply, almost rhythmically. It's oddly comforting. Proof that, for all the weight and weirdness of your thoughts, you're still part of something breathing and alive. You shift under the covers again. Not quite warm, not quite cold, not quite ready to sleep. And so your thoughts keep drifting toward the things you weren't supposed to think about. Because for every rule medieval society imposed on sex, there were 10 ways people broke it, or sidestepped it, or just quietly ignored it until the moment passed. Let's talk about masturbation. Yes, it happened. Of course it happened. But was it allowed? Absolutely not. At least not officially. Church teachings were loud on this front. Self-pleasure was considered wasteful, sinful, even dangerous. Medieval theologians believed it could weaken the body, corrupt the soul, and summon demons. One bishop wrote that it was the gateway to madness and heresy, which frankly sounds like an impressive overreaction. Historians still argue whether these dire warnings were genuinely believed or just tools of control. What we do know is that men were frequently the focus of this moral panic. Women, less so. Maybe because male monks were the ones writing the rules, and projecting their guilt accordingly. But guilt didn't stop desire. Manuscripts from the era are full of hidden notes, tiny marginalia scribbled between the lines of sermons or ledgers. Some are drawings of monks kissing. Some are cheeky sketches of nuns lifting skirts. These weren't public statements. They were whispers in ink, private jokes scratched into vellum when no one was looking, quiet rebellions of the hand. And speaking of nuns, no, they weren't always celibate paragons, neither were monks. There are entire court records filled with tales of affairs between cloistered men and women, sometimes even entire networks of trysts between neighboring monasteries and convents. One abbess in Germany was caught with a secret passage built between her chambers and the nearby monks' quarters. Engineering meets yearning, but here's where it gets even stranger. The church itself, for all its rules, occasionally looked the other way. If a wealthy nun's family had donated enough land, for instance, her misbehavior might be quietly buried under a new stained glass window donation. As always, money softened morality. You think back to the stories of saints you were told as a child, how some of them fought off temptation by leaping into thorn bushes. One even threw himself into an icy pond every time he had a lustful thought. You've never seen anyone do that in your village, but you have seen people lie to themselves about desire. It's quieter, but no less painful. Then there were the sex manuals. Yes, those existed too. Not nearly as common as prayer books, of course, but tucked away in the libraries of curious nobles or progressive physicians. One of the oldest is the Speculum Alfoderi, a Catalan treatise that blends anatomy, astrology, and what can only be described as Renaissance bedroom advice. And it's illustrated, helpfully. Such books weren't pornography in the modern sense. They were education, or at least that was the excuse. But they proved that curiosity was alive and well, even when society tried to smother it with shame. And what about same-sex relationships? These too existed, though rarely openly. Men loving men, women loving women. It happened in convents, in court circles, in quiet corners of candlelit halls. Sometimes it was condemned harshly, especially when found out. Other times it was cloaked in ambiguous friendship. Companions, they called them. Special friends. Some even shared graves. Historians still debate whether these relationships were always sexual or merely romantic. But the point is, they existed. And they mattered. Because even when the world tried to erase desire that didn't fit the mold, it still bloomed. In poems, in letters, in glances across crowded chapels, you remember a tale about a knight and his squire. They fought side by side for years, bled for each other, lived in the same tent, slept beneath the same fur blankets. When the knight died, the squire refused to leave the grave. Was it brotherhood? Was it love? The chronicler didn't say. But you can read between the lines. Most people could. Back in your bed, you feel a snore vibrate through the straw. Someone shifts and kicks your shin. You resist the urge to retaliate. Peace is precious tonight. You think about how the body itself was treated. how it was seen as both sacred and shameful. Nudity, for example, wasn't inherently erotic. In bathhouses, it was just normal. Men and women sometimes bathed together in towns where public hygiene mattered more than modesty. But outside that context, nakedness could trigger outrage, or arousal, or both. Context was everything. Even childbirth was steeped in contradiction. It was a moment of profound physical intimacy, often surrounded by women, overseen by a midwife, veiled in ritual. Yet it was also terrifying, dangerous. Many women didn't survive it, and the church treated that danger as a kind of moral crucible. Give life, risk death, be sanctified through suffering. Yet people still created life, again and again, in spite of the cold, the hunger, the guilt. Because for all its complexity, sex remained one of the most human things you could do. It bound people to each other, made them vulnerable, made them strong. There's a kind of hope in that. You stretch your legs slightly, careful not to elbow your cousin. The fire is nearly out, and you consider whether to add one last log. Maybe later. For now, you lie still and listen to the deep quiet. Desire in the medieval world was never simple, but it was never absent. And that's what you're left with tonight. Not scandal, not shame, but the quiet recognition that longing has always lived here, beneath the wool, between the prayers, inside the stories people told when the lights went out. The moon hangs high now, spilling a faint glow through the warped wooden shutters. It doesn't cast much light, just enough to outline the beams and stir a few silvery patches across the floor, where the mice tiptoe and the cold presses in. You lie still, eyes barely open, brain buzzing with fragments of all you've heard and felt and half believed. And here, near the edge of sleep, you begin thinking about how differently people measured love. The medieval world didn't have dating apps or romantic comedies. Courtship wasn't about candlelit dinners or shared playlists. It was politics, family ties, economic necessity, and occasionally, yes, actual affection, but rarely in the order you'd prefer. Marriage was a tool, a negotiation. If you were a peasant, your parents might choose your partner based on which neighbor had a sturdy goat and a slightly less leaky roof. If you were noble, it was worse. Marriage often meant being shipped off to a stranger's castle with instructions to behave, reproduce, and stay quiet. And yet, love found its way in. Secret meetings in the orchard, a borrowed scarf, a glance during Vespers. In some rare cases, people even married for affection. More often, they found affection after the fact or sought it elsewhere. Which brings us to extramarital sex, another forbidden door, perpetually ajar. It happened constantly, illicit, passionate, or simply bored encounters between spouses and their lovers, maids and their lords, apprentices and their masters. Sometimes it ended in gossip, sometimes in public penance, barefoot through the village, sackcloth over the shoulders, a priest muttering prayers like a disappointed uncle. Historians still argue whether village elders genuinely punished affairs or just pretended to when enough people complained. Some finds were documented, sure, but plenty more were probably settled with a nod, a wink, and a fresh chicken under the table. One of the stranger facts, in some regions, especially across the Alps, couples could perform a sort of pre-marriage trial run called hand fasting, a public agreement to live as man and wife for a year and a day. If they still liked each other after that, they made it official. If not, they walked away. No paperwork required. Romantic, revolutionary, or just terribly practical. But if you want peak medieval relationship drama, look no further than the church. Because while priests weren't allowed to marry, they frequently had what were politely called housekeepers who stayed for decades. Children quietly appeared. Everyone looked the other way. Even popes fathered children. Officially, illegitimate, of course, but still fully documented. Alexander VI, for example, was particularly prolific, and yet his sermons preached chastity. That was medieval consistency in action. Do as I say, not as I secretly fund. And if we dig a little deeper, we find something more human than hypocrisy. We find longing. Even in the rules and rituals, love wasn't a straight line. It twisted through expectations, bent under shame, then bloomed anyway, right there in the cracks. People carved lovers' names into chapel walls. They tucked pressed flowers into prayer books. They wrote poems in the margins of tax records. Sometimes the only way to say I love you was to embroider it into a handkerchief or bake it into a pie. And as for sex itself, yes, the mechanics were known. Not always accurately, but known. Herbal guides detailed aphrodisiacs, parsley, saffron, anise. Others warned about lusty humors and the need to balance bodily fluids with cold baths and bitter herbs. One medical text from the 1300s suggested that too much sex would thin the spirit, leaving the brain softened like overcooked porridge. An oddly specific warning. There were also ideas about when sex was safe, not for avoiding pregnancy, though there were methods, mostly unreliable, but for preserving moral standing. Certain days were forbidden. Lent, Advent, Sundays, feast days, fast days. For some couples that left maybe 50 acceptable nights per year. A generous estimate. Yet people kept going. Quietly, clumsily, rebelliously. Behind barn doors, under cloaks, in lofts, in stables, in shadows. And in the morning, they acted like it hadn't happened, or like it didn't matter. But of course, it did. You remember hearing an old woman in the village talk about her youth, how she once climbed into a hay cart with her sweetheart and emerged with hay in her hair and stars in her eyes. She'd tell the story like it was a fairy tale, except it wasn't. It was just life, messy, honest, very itchy. Some love stories ended well. Many didn't. A girl pregnant out of wedlock might be shunned, whipped, even locked up in a nunnery, or worse. But sometimes the village closed ranks, helped, pretended the baby was born early, or belonged to someone else. Because everyone had a cousin with a secret, and sometimes survival meant kindness. You shift again under the covers, now fully aware of the straw poking your ribs. Someone beside you mutters in their sleep. The fire's gone out completely. Cold curls around your feet, but your thoughts keep warm. They trace back over every story, every whisper, every forbidden kiss you've imagined tonight. And you realize what really survived wasn't the doctrine, the laws, or the lectures. It was the need to be close to someone, to be held, to be known. The medieval world was harsh, but not heartless. And even in the most frozen corners of winter, someone, somewhere, was whispering, "I love you," into the dark. Your breath rises slowly now, visible in the dark as a pale wisp that hangs in the stillness, then fades. You've done what you can for the day. Fed the animals, soaked the beans, patched the roof hole with a questionable bundle of cloth. You've listened, remembered, imagined. And somehow, here in the hush of medieval night, you're not quite ready to sleep, but you're close. Let your thoughts drift to the private spaces where people let their masks fall, where all the church sermons and social rules quieted, just a little, and something softer took their place. Not just lust, not just longing, but intimacy. The part of human connection that survives everything, even centuries. In those small cottages and crumbling manor halls, there were secrets shared beneath wool blankets and behind barn doors. Lovers traced each other's faces by firelight, fingers intertwined under tables. Even the poorest, even the most devout, everyone found a moment now and then to be just held. Historians still argue whether affection had any real place in arranged marriages. Some say it was rare. Others point to old letters, sweet, clumsy, affectionate, that prove people made the best of what they had. A husband who learned to love the woman he'd barely known. A wife who started laughing at her husband's bad jokes. Familiarity can breed contempt, sure, but it can also breed comfort. And in the realm of sex itself, let's not pretend they didn't know what they were doing. Sure, there were myths, like the one about women needing to climax to conceive, or that a man's seed was like a sacred fire. But trial and error taught them plenty. Curiosity found a way. It always does. In some villages, older women served as unofficial advisors, teaching young brides what to expect, what to endure, and what to enjoy if they were lucky. Men too sought advice, often from soldiers or travelers with stories more colorful than accurate. One popular tale involved a Venetian courtesan who wore gold-threaded slippers and never said no. She likely never existed, but that didn't stop the story from spreading like wildfire. There were also talismans, little amulets worn under clothing to protect fertility, enhance desire, or ward off impotence, often made from herbs, feathers, even carved bone. Were they effective? Doubtful, but they gave people a sense of control, and that's its own kind of magic. Remember that time someone mentioned aphrodisiacs? Parsley and honey, of course, but also eel livers, crushed beetles, powdered antlers, things that sound more like a witch's stew than a romantic snack. But again, it was about hope. And hope in medieval times was a powerful stimulant. Still, not all nights ended in candlelit bliss. Some ended in cold silence, misunderstandings, betrayal, hurt, the same emotional messiness we face now, only with fewer outlets and no therapy. And yet, even there, people endured. They learned to speak without words, to forgive with gestures, to carry love in small, practical ways. A warm meal, a dry cloak, an extra log on the fire. Eventually, the church softened just a little. By the late Middle Ages, even priests began preaching the virtues of affection within marriage. Not just duty, but tenderness. Not just reproduction, but companionship. That's no small shift. It meant that love, once confined to poems and songs, was inching its way into the everyday. And as you lie here now, with the wind muttering against the shutters and the last embers whispering their glow, you start to feel it too. That persistent hum beneath the world's noise. The thing that makes humans reach for each other, even when everything else falls away. Your straw-stuffed bedding creaks as you shift. The air smells faintly of smoke, wool, and whatever's left of dinner. Someone's breathing softly beside you. It could be a sibling, a cousin, a lover, a stranger you'll grow to care about, or not. But they're warm, and that's something. You stare up at the ceiling beams, tracing the familiar knots in the wood. Your fingers curl under the blanket, and for a fleeting moment, you imagine you're not in the 1300s or the 1400s, but here, tonight, with every comfort stripped away except the most important ones. A little warmth, a little safety, and the thought of someone else out there, listening to this, curled in their own blanket, sharing this strange sleepy moment with you. And even though the sex may not have been great, or frequent, or comfortable, or clean, it was still human, still real, still part of the long, awkward, beautiful story of being alive. Let yourself breathe now, deeply and slowly. You've walked through darkened cottages and bitter wind, heard the muffled gossip of townsfolk and the crackle of firewood as it caught flame. You felt the rough linen, the chill of water in a wooden pail, the low murmur of lovers who weren't supposed to love. And still, you've arrived here, on the other side of it all. Let your muscles soften, unclench your jaw. Let the corners of your mouth ease, as if you've just heard a joke you're not supposed to laugh at in church. The kind you smile at quietly, under your breath. Out beyond the walls of this imagined village, the world still turns. Spring is still waiting, but there's no rush. Not tonight. You've spent time not just learning history, but feeling it. Breathing it in like wood smoke and winter air. And maybe, just maybe, finding a little bit of yourself in the voices and shadows of those who came before you. Their stories were awkward and brave, complicated and ordinary, kind of like yours. So rest now. The shutters are drawn, the embers are low. The wind is gentler, outside snow falls like old secrets, soft and slow and patient. And inside this moment, you are safe, warm, and still breathing. Good night.